I think the first thing is to lower your expectations. So we'll take just a minute to do that. And then I want to say thank you to Beth for organizing this, and to all the colleagues in the UI for, I get emotional very easily. Okay, so thank you to the colleagues in the UI for hosting me for so many years, for being here today. Thanks for Vanessa for accepting to comment on the book, and also to Vicky for all the work that she has done to prepare today's event. Okay, so I'm going to read, and that's largely your fault. I mean, not your fault directly, it's your country's fault, because when I came here 15 years ago, I was the true Italian self. I could speak without reading. Now I cannot anymore, so you will bear me for an hour reading, okay? So yes, the book is called For a Liberatory Politics of Home, and it's a book that largely is started really with my PhD research at Durham University back in 2008. At the time, I did my fieldwork in Turin looking at issues of homelessness, and I've always been interested in the relationship between the idea and the practice of home and the idea and the practice of homelessness. So in a sense, it's coming out of all of this, but particularly it's coming out of my profound dissatisfaction. So it's not really a nice place to start, but it comes out of a dissatisfaction with how issues of home and homelessness are dealt with in scholarship, in activism, in policy, and in particular in policy. So essentially, I'm moved by the belief that current understandings of home and homelessness are inadequate, and they are also dangerous. I think they are inadequate because they reduce homelessness to something that takes place in the realm of exceptionality. And I also think they are dangerous because they sustain particular ideas and ideologies of home, hence foreclosing other ways of inhabiting the world. I believe there is no possible adjustment, no innovative intervention, and no salvation for homelessness, housing precarity, housing injustice, if we do not crack through home itself. So this means many things, including challenging scholarship and policies, including challenging patriarchy, the financialization of housing, the violence of racial capitalism. But above all, for me, it means to retrieve and then to build upon the desire for liberation that constantly unfolds and lingers through the interstices of home and its foundational lessness. So I will start with this. I will start with Paolo. So I met Paolo in 2009, and so we were just sitting on a bench, and Paolo was telling me, he was around his 40s. Paolo was telling me about a therapeutic community for drug users located in Tuscany. He spent there some time in the early 2000s, and part of the story was about how he got hooked to heroin when the stuff was freely available on the road. And part of the story was about him smuggling cocaine for tourists in expensive holidays in Kenya. But this was not the whole thing. There was, for instance, this whole affair of trying to get by in Turin, a city where he could sometimes afford to pay for shelter and sometimes not. Distributing flyers played a big role, he told me. Leafletting advertisements for a supermarket chain, for a pizza joint, for a new furniture shop that had just opened at the edge of the city. Above him, a whole chain of commissioning, a boss who received the leaflets from another boss who got them from the company. And Paolo was extracting some profit too. He had employees who he described to me as più fottuti di me, which means more fucked up than me. They work a little, pretending mostly, and then they threw most of the leaflets in the bins scattered along the rivers along the banks of the River Dora. The cost of life was very raw for Paolo. The showers in the homeless shelter of Via Sacchi shared with thousands of others. The nights without heating in the soffitta he managed to rent, the stuffed dark attic room for which he needed no document, no proofs, only ready cash and enough physical and mental balance to make it up the stairs at the night without looking down the well. The cheap alcohol he drank, a trade-off for heroin. The lack of meaningful encounters. He once told me, it seems as if the only people I meet are like me e non abbiamo niente da dirci. We don't have nothing to say to each other. Paolo was excited about a new relationship with a lady he was in love with. He was worried whether his mother would forgive him. He used to say that it was like una foglia d'autunno, an autumn leaf holding to the branch by a thread day after day, hours after hours. He was writing a book about this feeling and the life that caused it. It was going to be called Il rumore dell'erba che cresce, the sound of growing grass. It was about his journey through addiction and then out of it, in the becoming he was going through when I met him. He was typing this book on his Alcatel mobile phone by addressing messages to himself. He loved making collages, such as this one. He opened a Facebook account, made YouTube videos, delivering a peaceful message in search of a voice, a narrative that moved at his own tempo. He was living, after a few years that we left Turin, in a garden shack in someone else's property. But his life was more serene at the time. He could think about his passion for football and for dogs. He would download pictures of puppies from the web and then put glasses on them using Windows Paint, adding some flowers, the symbol of Cagliari Calcio, and the word peace. He was taking care of his own dwelling in his own world. Paolo, the heroin addict, the drunken, the boss, the dispossessed, the peer educator, the giver and taker, the informant and friend, the sunburned hustler, Paolo the less, Paolo the homeless. Now, Paolo is clearly the other of home. He lacks shelter. He lacks ontological security. He roams in a field of becoming populated by subjectivities that in the worst are racialized, dispossessed, and jailed, while at the best are rendered as subjects waiting to be studied and in need to be saved. And one might ask, who does such a rendering? For Paolo clearly might have seen himself as somebody lacking a proper dwelling and a just way of inhabiting planet Earth, but he did not see himself just as that. It is as if, in order to make sense of Paolo's place in the world, and in order to be able to deal with that place, as if something must be expelled from him. To access the dormitory, he needs to show a side of himself ready to wait, ready to move when asked, ready to show he needs it. To apply for housing, he will fit a persona. And as many scholars have shown before me, homelessness requires this kind of performativity in order to get what Craig Wilson has called the homeless industry to even look at you. Now, that such segmentation is there sounds almost obvious. Most here, I'm sure, will think, well, of course, if the man is housing, he must be dealt with as someone who needs that. We cannot deal with the rest. It would become unmanageable. Such thought process is still at the core of the leading approaches to fix the homelessness issue. On the one hand, we have approaches taking a liberal stance. The homeless, defined as such, must be helped by giving them access to a minimum level of capabilities, albeit neither it is clear who must do such a job, nor it is clear what will happen after capabilities will be granted. The fact that the same state or social agencies who should provide such capabilities are the ones colluding in the first place with racial financial capitalism, who render lives on planet Earth less and less capable of living, it is not to be registered or discussed. On the other hand, we have the real specialists, those defining in the most accurate possible sense, with the clearest fidelity scales and analytical grids, who is supposed to be homeless, and among the various subcategorization, who is supposed to do what and for whom. Now, bear with me And for example, take the following text that shows how leading scholars of homelessness across the Atlantic, UK, US, and Europe, who are all working with their own respective national governments, are proposing to develop a global framework for conceptualizing and measuring homelessness. Now, in looking at this, I'm asking you, who's who and what is expelled in order to extract what can be contained in such powerful framings? Here we are confronted with people living into tents, cheap hotels, streets, temporary accommodation, cars, but never really with people. Here we are confronted with a series of spotlights on specific points on a vast region in a move that renders the view of the overall structural and relational cartography not only impossible, but also unnecessary. Segmentation, this kind of segmentation, works as an effective and conceptual machine, charting a specific terrain as a desire canvassing a specific geographical imagination that in turn defines the meaning of being knowledgeable and the possibility of being political. Now, for many years, I thought that I was interested in the violence of such segmentation, on what such a violence does to the subject who is not at home. And then I realized something. At some point, we realize things, right? I realized something. But the problem is not that such a segmenting does not work to bring the subject back home. That's not the problem. Because this is clear. It does not work. It never really worked. Our approaches to end homelessness do not work. They never really did. They do not work because in the world we have 1.6 billion people living in precarious housing conditions and the number keeps rising. Also in the West, they do not work because even in extremely wealthy places like Sheffield, London, Turin, we have more and more people sleeping rough, more and more people couch surfing, more people being beaten and violated within their homes, more and more elderly folks doing reverse mortgages on their houses in a gambling with biological lives and interest rates, people, as Kite and Lamarck have put it, who are alive only insofar as they are counted as mortgaged lives. More and more communities pushed to live under the spell of the ecological collapse of their lands. Those approaches, that from the national to the global, from the local charity to UN habitat, do not work because we cannot even have the collective decency to say that the current domicide, urbanicide, and xenocide in Palestine might bear some significance to our global capacity to stay alive in a meaningful way. Approaches that do not work because if homelessness is about not being at home, then all of the examples that I just made are about the destruction and violation of habitability, and nothing gets ever really fixed by calls to sheltering and by humanitarian action. It is at the threshold of this last point of how things get dealt with, where I began to look at home and homelessness differently. The epistemic and material creation of the other of home, whichever home is not a side effect of something that went wrong at home. It's not the effect of market failings, policy shortcomings, family break-ins. And it is neither just a perverse form of revanchist control on deviant populations. Rather, it is home in itself that is violent. In this view, Paolo is no other to home. Paolo the homeless. It is always already at home. I'll give you another example. One of the first encounters that I had when I moved back to Italy 3 years ago was with the story of Moussa Bald, a 23 years old Ghanaian man who migrated to Italy in 2017. His story is very complex, however, its ending is tragically straightforward. On Sunday, May 23, 2021, Moussa took his life in Turin's repatriation center. Now, these are jails where migrants who are not requesting asylum and are found without valid documents to staying in the country, or asylum seekers who are denied asylum, these are places where these people are detained for a maximum of 18 months, within which a judge needs to decide their fate. Either the asylum is requested, or any other favorable solution is accepted, or the individual is expelled from the country. Now, Moussa did not wait so long. On May 23, 2021, he hanged himself in the cell where he had been locked up a few days earlier as the result of his arrest by the local police in Ventimiglia in the Liguria region. He was arrested after he was brutally beaten up by a group of 3 fascists in the street on May 9. Now, the fascists got away free, but Moussa was detained because the police, while escorting him to the hospital, found out that his resident permit had expired. Local activists were able to speak to some of the other inmates in the detention center, and one of them confirmed, and here I'm quoting, that despite showing clear signs of suffering caused by the injuries on his body, Moussa was never examined by a doctor or member of the medical staff at the detention center, and that after his transfer to solitary confinement, which took place without clear reason, I heard, this is the activist talking, the inmate talking, sorry, I heard Moussa screaming and asking for doctor's intervention without ever receiving a response, end quote. Now, in an interview, which is available online, recording in 2018, not long after his arrival in the country, Moussa stated his reason for making this perilous journey. I'm quoting Moussa here. I have decided to come to Italy to escape the very difficult political situation in my country. I would like to stay in Italy because in this country, I have had a taste of how beautiful life can be. What I want to do is to study in order to find a good job and live well, end quote. Now, Paolo and Moussa's story are very, very different, clearly, but they are united by being both stories of individuals that were not welcome at home. One because of his multiple addictions and working class status, the other for being Black and being without documentation. They are also similar because in being subjects rendered as the other of home, both became subjecthoods to be dealt with. One by the normative governmentalities supposedly there to find him shelter, finding food, and eventually finding housing. The other by the European militarized border regime in its far-right Italian implementation. Now, starting from these lives and their local and global ramification, in this book I ask, would it be enough to shelter all the homeless in the world to end homelessness? Would it be enough to shelter Paolo and Moussa's to end their homelessness? Now, clearly, confronted with their struggles, the immediate answer would be a resounding yes. This is what humanitarian approaches, but also liberal approaches such as Housing First would argue. But answering yes to such a question means to avoid tackling the fundamental questions underpinning the possibility for Paolo and Moussa to be made subject of the other of home in the first place. What is housing going to solve without a deeper questioning of the ways in which issues of class, substance consumption, mental health, migration, race, and construction of nationhood contribute to produce subjectivities made less, rendered less, managed as less, worked out as less, jailed as less, who can only escape these kind of entrapments as less, in further subtraction, either by hiding out as Paolo did, or by taking their own life as Moussa did. Now, despite what common sense dictates, homelessness does not end with housing. And crucially, homelessness does not end at home. The same normative, classist, and racializing home that has expelled Paul and Musa can take them back. It can provide shelter, but at large, it would not be any less normative, racist, classist. That same home, even in taking them back, could still make them redundant once more. Such a home cannot be a solution to homelessness, because such a home is a less in itself, for it is founded on the possibility of its annihilation. So therefore, in my reading, home and homelessness are matter of the same. I invite to transcend the binary reading of the two, and to speak instead of homelessness with a parenthesis, the common violent substratum through which home gets to replicate itself via processes of expulsion and extraction. And I'm going to say something about this in a second. Talking of homelessness is to affirm that home contains in itself the possibility of not being at home. Home contains in itself the possibility of not being at home. For one can be made to inhabit a space of the less without requiring home to alter its parameters. This is what I call the impossible possibility of home, the impossible possibility offered by home, a salvation designed around its annihilation, a tension sitting very much at the heart of what is made to count as other, and now that other is governed from the level of individual subjections through the diagrams of global boundaries. Now, it is very important for me at this point to clarify one thing straight away. In refusing to see home and homelessness as distinct, I do not dismiss, clearly, the different ways in which their same foundation is experienced. That is the way in which homelessness is lived and felt. The experience of living rough or in a violent household or under the constant threat of eviction has experientially nothing in common with the privilege I am currently having as a white non-binary person reading these notes to you, surrounded by people I love, with a working combi boiler in my house and a stable mortgage, or at least I think it's stable. These experiences are not only temporary and spatially specific, but they have much to do with longer structurations intersecting forms of violence, extraction, expulsion, and embodiments. Encompassing the home-homelessness binary is not about flattening what Robert de Gerlaise has called the sharp cultural, historical, political, and pragmatic forces shaping the experience of housing precarity. So thinking about homelessness does not mean that we are all homeless in the conventional sense of the word. Very far from it. It means that we are all at home, and that home is really violent, and it needs to be burned down. It does not need to be adjusted. It does not need to be solved. It does not need to be saved. It needs to be burned down. It means to say that the sharpest experiences of homelessness, including but not limited to sleeping rough, living in camps, prison, violent household, gendered and cisnormative spaces, and racialized lives, are not taking place in a realm separated from the idyllic pastures of our safe homes. Put simply, home is not extraneous to displacement and dispossession, but possible, because it displaces and dispossesses. Navigating this fine line across experiences and their common substratum is very difficult, especially if done from the standpoint of the academy, which much has done to colonize all experiences. And yet, I want to take this risk, and I want to navigate this line, because advancing a joint understanding of the two means, for me, two important things. One, it means to decolonize homelessness from home, as well as imagining a home that does not need an otherness to be defined. That is really my aim. Try to think home without its otherness. Can you think home without thinking about the fact that home at some point may not exist? My argument is that you cannot. So in a sense, what is home all about then? If it does not grant salvation, what does it grant? Home, I argue in the book, is a colonial project. It is a matter of colonial production of subjects, spaces, affects, relations. Saying that home is a colonial project does not mean to flatten the discourse around settled colonialism and its specifics of land grabbing and occupation. But it's possible to recognize how the fundamental diagrams at play through the latter are key to the inner constitutive dynamics of home too. Now, as Said reminded us, for a colonial project to exist, something and someone needs to be occupied, and therefore, and this is important, to be constructed as worth being occupied. So in the book, I work with Mezzadra and Nielsen to show how the bordering of the homely, what is home, what is not home, works precisely in this sense. It is a diagram doing what Said has talked about, through two concomitant moves. First, it carves out a space for itself by defining an alterity. And second, while keeping that alterity at bay, it constitutes a violent relationship with it, through which values can be extracted and become essential for the reproduction of home itself. My question is, what is home in contemporary racial capitalism without its otherness? How can its mainstream security, its belonging, its ecological, economic, gender, racial, and vitalist affordances be maintained if one breaks through the definition and management of the alterity at its core? Now, key to this particular line of thinking is to conceive home as a nexus where what Hagar Kotef calls various objects of violence come together. Answering the above question requires identifying the affective and political economy of home more precisely. In the book, I expand on this in ways that I clearly cannot do it here, also because we have to drink that wine at some point. But I try to discuss the colonies of home, such as the constitution of the homely via the creation of nature and of the wild other, the constitution of the homely via the reproductive economy of the patriarchal and heteronormative, hence the creation of a specific femininity and gender binaries attached to the perceived feminine and the perceived masculine body. The constitution of the homely as a white space and of a national whiteness, in the case I investigate in Italy, vis-a-vis the creation and management of the black other, as well as, of course, as the capacity of capitalist flows to intersect these borders and make them work in productive ways to generate value, albeit this value exceeds capitalist formations. Think, for instance, and this is very important for Italy, the value generated to charitable intervention, the idea of loving the poor. So if I don't have time here to explore these multiple borders, I want to spend a few minutes now to highlight the conceptual grammar I propose in the text to understand what unites them, what holds them together. What kind of operation unites the colonial project of home? So getting closer to the borders of home, one can hear almost the sound of something expelled and yet kept very close, the rhythm of a movement that can change forms but maintain a specific tempo across bordering practices to sustain the homelessness binary. And at the bare minimum, the key feature of such a refrain seems to revolve for me around two baseline functions, which in the book, echoing traditions spanning from Marxist feminism and critical race thinking, I identify with the notions of expulsion and extraction. So now I'm spending a little bit of time on these two. Here I'm trying to describe how home and its lessness are co-constituted. Yeah? Now, expulsion denotes a double-phased segmentation. Remember what I said before about Paulo. It is a cutting off of the other, which entails its creation of other. Now, somebody who wrote beautifully about this, albeit using different terminologies, is Sarah Hammett in her work, Strange Encounters. On the one hand, expulsion creates a normative assemblage by selectively deciding what belongs and what is made to fit. On the other hand, it engages in a process of othering, silencing, and erasing which doesn't fit, which becomes to be defined against the exclusionary norm. Now, this is not a simple matter of selecting subjects who are in and out. This is not Saskia Sassen's expulsion that I'm talking about here. Expulsion works through segmentations intersecting multiple planes of subjectivity, because one can be made homely in a number of concomitant ways. We have seen this process at play in the first part of my presentation. A subject is created by reducing an entire life to a manageable segment for various ends, such as being loved, being governed, being kept in check, or being a gateway for forms of extraction. Now, as we have seen in the case of Paulo, the rough sleeper is created, and I know this is a very strong word, right? But the rough sleeper is created by reducing an entire life to a codified experience, which is in part expelled from home and in part at the same time made available for further operations. Now, clearly, this does not mean that the intense experience of sleeping rough with all its trauma and material harshness is a simple epistemological creation. Rather, it means to say that through that particular experience, an epistemological colonization takes place, which is also a political act. It is about the codification of a complex experience into a politics reducing its complexity to a given quantity from which the extraction of value can take place. And on this threshold, extraction is operationalized. Now, the bordering of home is not something that finishes with the creation of the homeless and its like. It is maintained and reproduced through the appropriation of that alternative for strategic types of appropriations. And here you see one of these strategic types in the context of the country where I work and come from. In this sense, extraction creates value from expulsion, where value is understood in the largest possible sense. The value that is extracted through expulsion includes a broad set of social, cultural, and economic assets that are made to count as valuable by those operationalizing expulsion for their own ends. Now, what are these forms of extraction and value production? They include social affirmation, parental authority, because the bordering of home happens also within the four walls of the house, moral justification, accrual of epistemic privilege, sexual pleasure, alongside old-fashioned profiteering. Now, expulsion and extraction are those two functions made to work across the land of the less in order to maintain and reproduce home in its current fashion. An impossible possibility founded in defining its other and in extracting legitimacy and power from it. Now, following Guattari, I call this work, the work that expulsion and extraction do, a form of ritornello, because it is a recursive and also because it's not simply a script, it's not a formula. Expulsion and extraction take place in different ways, in different forms, vis-a-vis the subjective maps, histories, and geographies they interlace with. But a sense of direction, this is what interests me, a sense of direction is maintained across domains, allowing for the usual homely song to be sung for the many. Now, expulsion and extraction are the reproductive core of the becoming of our dear home under contemporary racial capitalism. And to illustrate this point further, I focus the book on the case of Italy, and in particular on two ritornellos that are very important for the constitution of the homely in the country: patriarchy and racial capitalism. In selecting these, I'm following the suggestion brought to the fore by the late Umberto Eco when he introduced and discussed the notion of ur-fascism, or eternal fascism. For Eco, the Italian Resistenza won the battle against the fascist regime, but not against a much wider and deeper cultural fascism that, in his opinion, underpins the recent history of the country. For Eco, the fascism of contemporary Italy, and here I'm quoting, is defined by a series of characteristics including machismo, cult of tradition, appeal to the frustrated middle classes, fear of difference, contempt of the weak. And these, to me, also in relation to my own experience, are forms of violence speaking the lexicon of patriarchy and racialized class formations. So now, due to space constraints, I'm here just giving a snippet of the letter of the racial capitalist part to move then to the political proposal at the core of my project. Now, the racialized link between land, law, and blood becomes the structure of today's Italian home and a means to define their definition of security vis-à-vis the wilderness of the other. In the book, I trace the lineage of the racist Italian home, starting with the fascist colonial project, as well as through the writings of Catholic popes, which is really, really fun shit, but I'm not going to tell you anything about that now because I don't have the time. Now, a telling example of this kind of constitution, of racist constitution of the Italian home, is related to the matter of citizenship. Even after the demise of the fascist regime, the state reaffirmed legal belongings. It was possible only on the basis of what is called jus sanguinis, by which citizenship is transmitted only from a parent or ascendant in possession of citizenship themselves, therefore providing for the continuation of the whitening principle inscribed in the racial colonial project of the fascist state today. Now, following a critical Italian historian called Valeria De Plano, and here I'm quoting her, by maintaining the same inclusion and exclusion criteria devised in 1912, with all their racist undercurrents, the nascent Republic of Italy became a state that was still heavily imbued with colonialist culture, end quote. Now, crucially, the change brought to the fore by reforms in the 1990s did not alter these logics, but possibly reinforced them, this time in the light of raising levels of immigration in the country. According to Camilla Hawthorne, the new 1992 law of citizenship in Italy, and I'm quoting Camilla here, reinforced the principle of jus sanguinis from the original 1912 fascist Italian citizenship law. It became easier for Italian in diaspora, such as Italian living in Brazil or Argentina, who had never set foot in Italy to reacquire citizenship, and more difficult for immigrants and their Italian-born children to naturalize. Citizenship here works as a bordering process through which, as Camilla Hawthorne has again argued, African bodies are remarked as iconic signifiers of illegitimate belongings, suggesting that their very being in an Italian place threatens the moral purity of the nation state, end quote. Now, crucially, it is not only that all Black others are banned, but that their selective inclusion takes place through an act of expulsion. If they can accept the racial script, leaving out what is not needed, homely Italian belonging may be enjoyed. Such expulsion is, of course, very productive. It reinforces a whitened discourse of Italianness, it creates political legitimacy, it activates economic profit-making. Now, with the story of Musa before, we saw an example of the first 2 points. It suffices to say that the Meloni government, the current government we have, has extracted much value in mobilizing the Black other as a threat she needs to legitimize, a threat she needs to legitimize a certain kind of action, but also she needs to keep that threat at bay by jailing him. Now also with our own Rwanda affair, because we are also opening those kind of detention centers in one of our ex-colonies in Albania. But let me give you an example of the other kind of extraction, more explicitly related to homely economies. Now, for sure, because I know you love Italian cuisine, right? Pizza, pasta, tomatoes. Now, well, the whole system of extractive economies hinges on the production of subjects that are made not to belong formally in order to be forced to work illegally. Here I'm referring to the so-called agromafia business, at the core of which you find the practice of capolarato, a form of illegal recruitment of workers very common in the production of vegetables, in particular in the picking of tomatoes in the southern regions of Italy. According to the late investigative journalist Alessandro Leogrande, in the Apulia region during peak season, there are about 15,000 such illegal workers, 15,000. Salaries, when given, vary from 20 to 30 euros a day, or are related to how many boxes of tomato one can fill. 3 euros for a 375 kilos of tomato in a box. Workers live in homeless land, in abandoned factories, shelf-made shacks, and tents for the entire working season. Now, through this particular action, Italy can maintain its standing as the second biggest producer of tomato in the world, and the Italian home can enjoy its whitened and heteronormative pasta seasoned with cheap pomodoro sauce. In the Q&A, I can tell you why the pasta is not only racist, but is also heteronormative. Now, the capolarato system is a productive, expulsive, extractive diagram of power working through a double elision. As the Italian sociologist Gennaro Avallone argued, on the one hand, there is the disappearance of labor. Tomatoes are produced and arrived in the Italian home without signs of the traumatic belonging inscribed in them. On the other hand, there is the social disappearance of the migrant who is unaccounted for, never seen or heard, and those requests to belong is systematically rejected by the state. But this is not simply thrashing people away. This is maintaining a fundamental relationship with them. Through this double process of expulsion, migrant workers are reproduced, and here I'm quoting Gennaro, as alien, extraneous, absent subjects, although very present. Present for production, absent for everything else. My line of argument is essentially that they are present not only for the production of tomatoes, but for the production of home. The boundaries of the Italian home are not designed to give space to the desire of habitation of migrant workers, the asylum seekers like Musa, the conventionally homeless like Paolo, but also to many other subjectivities made less at the intersection of heteronormativity, patriarchy, racism, ecological disasters, class struggle, ableism, and more. The purpose of the boundaries of the homely is precisely to shut down such desire, not simply because of an ephemeral or transitory political will, but because the foundation of home are deeper and speak to the wider and shared racialized and nationalist earth fascism which Eco was writing about. The violent logics of the Italian home extend themselves beyond the household and come back there in a fold to work as the ultimate border in practice for forms of ontological securities, our ontological security, that grounded in past and present colonial histories are now characterized not only by pasta, mortgages, baptism, and marriages, but also by the figure of the hanged black person in the detention center, of that of the refugee awaiting asylum riding around circles on a bike, the only cheapest available transportation to them. They have been refused citizenship, refused ground, defined as unwelcome, and yet kept close by to feed and to justify homes where they will never, ever belong, but they need them to stand on their rotten foundations. And so, at this point, I ask, how can this kind of home pretend to save its other? Why should the subject that is made to experience expulsion in order to become a manageable value asset of the only through extraction be brought back home? The problem here is not just with the creation of that subject, the poor, the refugee, the homeless, the queer, etc., but with what is made to do. what state, religious, and humanitarian institutions do is the crux of the issue of the colonial project of home. On the one hand, the charitable and state institutions working with the subject made less could distract the continuity between the home that is expelled them and the one that is supposed to take them back. That would mean directly tackling the ritornello structure in home. It would not mean to house all the homeless of the world to solve homelessness. It would mean, in the quintessential restoration of housing, to challenge the expulsive and destructive logics of nationalism and racial capitalism, to cite just the two I tapped upon in my presentation today. The other option for these institutions is to continue to manage the other in the way they already do, to reproduce and maintain the multiple alterities of home with nature, with gender, with the black other, with the poor, without altering the basic expulsive and destructive formula of such operation, even when they manage to shelter the other. And so, in the book, I offer a proposition for a more radical endeavor, so to speak. Home must not be fixed. The other of home must not be saved. In the context of Italy, to say that the other of home must not be saved is a radical proposition because of our Catholic grounds. Okay, the notion of saving is very important. Home needs instead to be liberated. Coherently with the need to produce affirmations to get beyond the binaries of homelessness, I define liberated as that break to allow for emancipatory desires of habitation to emerge and take place into the world. Such a break is not the end point of a revolutionary effort, but the ongoing struggles to affirm from the interstices of homelessness that other ways of inhabiting the world are possible. So in the third part of the book, I illustrate what an initial strategy in this sense might entail. First, there is an epistemological move, a move about epistemology, and then there are, if you want, three political strategies. Of the epistemological move, I essentially already said. It is about transcending the segmentation of the other, to avoid the epistemic and material colonization. In the book, I discuss how the housing political does not reside only in enunciation of political formulas and action fitting those. Here, I'm picking against the Marxists. I extend a critique to forms of radical housing organizing who are too quick in discarding non-conventionally political forms of housing action. They discard them because they are a matter of desperation that has little to do with housing justice. I claim, on the contrary, that within the interstices of the lives lived by subjects such as Paul and Musa, if one is attentive to their desires and aspirations, there are already effective cartographies, but also concrete practices that signal a politics for and of habitation. And on the basis of this specific epistemological move, there are three political strategies to follow. The first one is what I call de-instituting. De-instituting through the practice of striking. If I am in conversation with feminists and queer thinkers and doers throughout the book, it is at this particular point that I find inspiration, in particular from the work of Veronica Gago. The focus here is on de-institutionalizing and fighting against the industries currently caring for the other of home, which include much of the current service provision for the homeless, as well as knowledge production around them. So I call for the total deinstitution of homelessness service provision as we know it today, but also of homelessness scholarship, which for the most anyway is a pile of crap. Deinstitutionalizing service provision is not something to be done through defunding, but through abolition, a move that indeed will require more funding, care, and dedication. The goal is to stop the circuit of value extraction from the other via its creation and control, to enable situated intervention tackling the multiple violences of home. To arrive there, the second move would be about reinstituting through radical caring. Here, the focus is on allowing ourselves to relearn how to care for habitation and its struggles, and to constitute on both bases a universal approach for housing focused on dwellers' control. The apparent resonance of this point with some current progressive policies, most notably housing first, is demystified entirely in the book. In my approach, housing does not come first, because housing never really comes first, not even in housing first. In housing first, housing is part and parcel of a liberal take on poverty management. In restituting, what is instituted again is housing, yes, but as a project to learn to care for habitation. Thinking with UK housing anarchists and Italian operaisti, I centered the practice of autonomy as central to such endeavor. And finally, on that threshold, institution through affirmation. This last move is focused on considering occupation and grassroots organizing as a viable alternative to interventions focused on policy change. Institution is therefore about bypassing state inertia and prefiguratively enacting the liberatory politics of home in the here and the now. As someone vetted to autonomist thinking and a person more and more grounded in queer understanding of the world, I do not intend the institution to be a plan, a solution for all. Affirmation is a practice to and by communities, to and by individuals, and not a planetary theory of super everything or a grand plan. Now, and here I'm concluding, as a prompt for our discussion today, I have provided some ideas to begin an investigation on how the border between home and homelessness is a porous, constitutive, intersectional matter reproducing colonizing mechanisms of expulsion and extraction, which enact a rhythmic form of the homely violence, uniting those who are supposedly at home and those who are supposedly not at home. It is easier to keep a binary reading of the both, to assume that, all considered, home is better than nothing and that we might be able to incrementally fix it. But such a posture carries an epistemic and material colonial violence that we must reject. The praxis of the instituting, restituting, and instituting can be already found, albeit scattered and non-aligned, in forms of collective organizing, squatting, and community-based direct action. The strength lies in rejecting ideas of a fix for all, in avoiding a fidelity scale. Liberation from homelessness, in this sense, will not consist in a new home. It will be the intensification of struggles against expulsion and extraction, leading to thousands different ways of being at home. In embracing the processual view discussed in this book, it is not granted that what I have just illustrated will be enough to institute new functions, new grounds for homing. It is not granted that such a ground will be stable, and it is indeed sure, it is sure that liberation will never come. But these are not disempowering narratives. A deep collective acknowledgement of the ongoing nature of the struggle to get beyond homelessness can be the ultimate liberatory gesture. So in such a view, no formation can be considered entirely safe, not for all. No arrangement and no design can accommodate once and for all. Here we can go back to books, when home really becomes an open-ended process. It really becomes what she brought about, a place which enables and promotes varied and ever-changing perspectives, a place where one discovers new ways of seeing reality, frontiers of difference, the plurality of such a statement. The ongoing struggle to maintain such a plurality is a liberatory politics of home. Such a homely place, to be coherent with its definition, can only be an ongoing revolution. A liberatory homing praxis leading to a variety of forms, a multiplicity of housing use values, united by guiding principles pointing beyond expulsion and extraction. So now, from my limited point of view, I have mentioned 3 of these points: the refusal of controlling so-defined homeless others, the need to center a differential way of caring about our capacity to constantly care for home, and the practice of constituting affirmative ways of working through the unjust, violent grounds of the lessness, the violent making less that we all currently inhabit. Thank you.